In this podcast, I want to talk about a major movie that won a lot of Oscars this year. You probably have seen it. It was called Everything Everywhere All at Once. And I'm a huge movie fan. It's probably one of the biggest things that I do in terms of hobbies and just relaxed time is I really enjoy watching movies, thinking about movies, talking about movies. So I saw it, and it was a big hit. So it came out last year, 2022. So in the 2023 Oscars, it was nominated for 11 Oscars. And then it ended up winning 7 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best Original Screenplay, Best Film Editing. And it was a fun movie. If you saw it, there was a lot of neat choreography. The fighting was almost kind of like a John Wick level of choreography, the fighting, the action, a lot of funny moments in it. So overall, it was pretty entertaining. But one of the reasons that I enjoy watching movies is discussing them. Because oftentimes, especially in good movies, there are major ideas being communicated in the movie. And in a sense, that's what art is, right? I mean, art is a way to communicate ideas. And all forms of art do that, whether it's paintings, comic books, music, in this case, movies. They're all trying to communicate a certain idea. Francis Schaeffer is really good about this, just kind of illustrating or showing how most of the big ideas in Western culture developed at the philosophical level. So philosophers, thinkers in Western culture developed some of these major ideas that shape culture, shape society, shape the way people think. But most people don't read philosophers because they can be dry, they can be difficult to understand. So what ends up happening in culture then is the artists who read the philosophers, they take the ideas and then incorporate them into their art. And that's ultimately how the masses are exposed to these philosophical ideas, is through the art. Starting with the philosophers, but then the artists take it and then communicate it through art. And that's what I think is happening with this movie. I think one of the reasons why it hit such a nerve is because it's really latched on to the major cultural conversation that's been taking place in Western civilization over the last 500 years plus. And if you're not familiar with that, you might not quite understand how the movie progresses or why the movie takes the course that it does, because it's really mapping out the history of our cultural thinking over the last few hundred years. So in this podcast, I thought I would try to lay out some of that basic history and then show how the movie illustrates it. Because it's important. It's not just entertainment. It's important for us to understand why people in our culture think the way they do today, if we're going to try to reach them for Christ. I always use the example, if you're going to be a missionary, let's say to China, well, you need to study the Bible, you need to study theology, study how to communicate the gospel, but you also should spend some time studying Chinese culture so that you can understand what they believe, why they think the way they do, so you can best communicate with them and reach them for Christ. The same thing is true in Western culture. If we're Christians living here in the West, America, Europe, and so much of the world has been influenced by the West, we need to understand, if we're a missionary to the West, and if you're a Christian, you are a missionary, we need to understand at least some basics about Western culture and why people in our culture think the way they do. So what I'd like to do is just give you just a run through of these big philosophical ideas and then show how the movie is really hitting on some of these key major themes. Oftentimes, and this isn't new to me, a lot of other people have done this, oftentimes our Western history is broken up into three stages: the pre-modern era, the modern era, and then the postmodern era. So if you can think about the pre-modern era, this would be, 1500s and earlier. So even there's a sense in which the pre-modern era, depends on how you describe it. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Greek philosophers, if you will. So you can talk about it being a matter of 2,000 years. Or you can just talk about the pre-modern era, at least in terms of Western civilization or Christian society, from around 300, 400 AD up to around the 1500s, so a 1,000-year period. I'm not concerned as much about putting an exact date on it, but just an era of time where most people thought in a pre-modern way. And what is that pre-modern way? Well, most pre-modern thinkers thought of life ultimately as the purpose, the meaning of life was to be in communion with God. That God created us to be, to have a relationship with Him in some way, shape, or form. People talked about it differently, being united with God, having communion with God, being a friend of God. But that was what they saw was the ultimate purpose and meaning of life: communion with God, having a relationship with God. I mean, even Jesus' commandments, right? He said the two greatest commandments are to love God and to love others. And so in the pre-modern era, that's how people thought about life. That was our purpose. We were created to love God and to love others. Now, what happened in the modern era, as our culture switched from a pre-modern way of thinking to a modern way of thinking, so this is taking place 1600s, 1700s. You think of the Renaissance maybe kicking off this era, and then definitely by the time we get to the scientific revolution and what's often called the Enlightenment of the 1700s, we're getting to more away from that pre-modern way of thinking. And there's a whole host of issues that were part of modernism, and it took various steps, and there were different movements that all culminated in eventually most people thinking in a more modern way. Well, what is that modern way of thinking then? Well, one of the things that came out of modernism was that human beings are merely biological machines. We weren't created for any particular purpose. In fact, definitely by the time you get to the 1800s, the basic understanding of humanity was that we were cobbled together through a haphazard process of evolution. And the scientific thinking at the time was very Newtonian, so deterministic laws of nature, if you will. Just think of like the laws of motion, right, from Newton. But beyond that, just the thinking was that was how the entire universe functioned. These determined laws, these scientific laws. Everything was determined. Everything was like a machine. The universe was one giant machine, and we were just cogs in that machine. We were determined. We didn't have any free will. We were just coupled together through a haphazard process of evolution. So we were these determined biological machines. And that's a pretty crushing blow when you really stop and think about it. Because if that's true, right, what does that do to meaning and purpose in life? Well, it basically eradicates it. There is no meaning and purpose to life. We're just here by accident. We weren't created by any intelligent mind for a particular reason or purpose. We just find ourselves here, in a sense, through this haphazard process of evolution that cobbled us together. And yeah, there are certain desires, there are certain things that we want, but it's just because our particular evolutionary path took a certain trajectory and led us to have the desires that we do. So just, for example, take our sexual desires, right? It would make sense why, if evolution, macroevolution, and modernism is all true, that nature would select, if you will, people who had greater sexual desires. Because a species similar to us that didn't have strong sexual desires wouldn't be as prone to pass on their genes through sexual reproduction. And so sexual desire was something that, nature selected, if you will, because it led to greater chances for survival and reproduction and passing on our particular genes. So love, what we call love, romantic love, is just what we've been programmed to do by our evolutionary programming. There's no meaning to love. It's just one of those things that nature selected because it helped produce more of us. And in the evolutionary fight with other species and fight with each other for resources and just life in general, it was those sort of things that were selected for that led to greater chances of survival and reproduction. So there's no ultimate purpose or meaning behind, in this case, romantic love. That's just our evolutionary programming. We're basically just robots. Another movie that I really enjoy is, a movie franchise, the Terminator franchise, going all the way back to the original Terminator movie from the early 80s, Arnold Schwarzenegger and all that stuff. But one of the best Terminator movies in the entire franchise was one that Arnold Schwarzenegger wasn't even in. It was called Terminator Salvation. Christian Bale played John Connor. But in the movie, it's very fascinating because in the movie, there is one particular character who thinks he's human. And he's walking around interacting with other humans, thinking that he's human. He goes on in life thinking that he's a human being. But then in the course of the movie, he realizes that he's actually a Terminator. He's actually a machine. He's actually a robot that's been programmed. And he cries out. It's such a great scene. I love that scene. It's so powerful because he cries out in agony when he comes to that realization that he is just a programmed robot. Because I think it's appropriate. If we come to the conclusion that we're just programmed robots, that's pretty devastating. Because it means that ultimately our life doesn't have any meaning or purpose. We're just here to try to satisfy our desires as best we can. And even those desires themselves don't have any meaning or purpose. They were just accidents, right, along the way of macroevolution that were selected for because they happen to lead to greater chances of survival and reproduction. And if our evolutionary path would have taken a different winding road, and Darwin has a lot of famous quotes about this. If our evolutionary path would have been more like wolves or more like bees, then our lives and desires and moral beliefs would be radically different. And so it's just kind of a haphazard, arbitrary process that we have the certain beliefs about love and morality that we do, meaning and purpose. And this was very devastating for Western culture. People who really came to grips with this, it was devastating. And a lot of people struggled with suicide. If this is really what life is, that we're just these biological programmed robots, it makes life meaningless. And that's a hell. That's a hell to really come to that conclusion about life and to try to live it out consistently. It's hell. It's very depressing, and it was devastating. And in fact, our culture couldn't handle it. I like to say that this was so painful and so against the grain of our very being that we couldn't deal with it as a culture, Western civilization. We couldn't stay in that modern way of thinking. It didn't last very long. Modernism ran into all sorts of problems, but this was probably the primary thing that drove people away from modernism. So what was the solution? How did we move from the modern era to the postmodern era? Well, and I'm summarizing just hundreds of years of Western thinking in a few minutes. But if I would just overgeneralize for a minute, what happened basically was several philosophical movements in both in the 1800s and the 1900s, all of them would be considered different postmodern movements, starting with the Romanticism era, Romanticism movement in the early 1800s, but all the way through the 1800s and the 1900s, movements like existentialism. All of these, I would say, are postmodern movements taking us to the postmodern era that we're in today, where most people think in a postmodern way. But basically, the solution then, or the postmodern solution to this hell of no meaning and no purpose, was that you can create your own meaning and purpose. Yeah, they agreed, the postmodern thinkers agreed with the modern thinkers that there is no meaning and purpose out there that you can discover. The universe is meaningless. We weren't created with any sort of objective meaning or purpose. But the postmodern solution is that you can create your own meaning to life. Whatever inflames your passions, if you will, inflames your excitement, that gives you zeal, that gives you a strong burden or conviction, well, then that is the meaning of life for you. So this is the birth of subjectivism, subjective truth, the idea that you can create your own meaning. And this becomes, the movement which we now call existentialism, the big European movement after World War II. They actually laid out their movement, existentialism, in these two steps. So the first step of existentialism is to have an existential crisis, to realize, to come to grips with the modern conclusion that life is meaningless. And this is where a lot of the artistic movements of existentialism came out, the theater of the absurd. A lot of movies and plays were done to try to illustrate. Think of some of the thinkers at the time, Sartre, Camus. Anybody who studies French has to read Albert Camus' work, a very famous French thinker. Wrote a lot of fictional novels and such. But this is the first step of existentialism, to realize that life is meaningless. And that's a very dangerous step. So a lot of the existentialists, as they were teaching, their students, they would say, look, when you have your existential crisis, make sure there's no gun around, because it is going to be so devastating that you are going to be tempted to commit suicide. But don't commit suicide. That might seem a reasonable thing to do, but they had to warn people this existential crisis, and it's true. When people went through it, when people go through it today, and they come to this realization that life is meaningless, they are tempted with suicide. And that's what happens in this movie. I'll drop back to the movie now. So in the movie, and I'll try not to spoil it if you haven't seen it, but no promises. There might be some spoilers coming up. If you haven't seen it, pause this, go watch the movie, and come back and finish this podcast later. But basically, in the movie, the daughter, it's about one family, mostly one family. And the daughter in the family experiences this existential crisis. She comes to the realization that life is meaningless, there is no purpose, and so she wants to destroy her life. She just wants to destroy it all. And it's done in a very, science fiction way with the multiverse and all sorts of other things. But the bottom line is she has an existential crisis, realizes that there's no meaning and purpose in life, and she wants to destroy herself and take everybody with her. Basically just end it all, because it's all pointless. But the second step of existentialism is this idea that no, wait, you can create your own meaning to life. Whatever gives you passion, that can be the meaning of life for you. And this ultimately becomes the message of the movie, right? As the movie kind of walks you through all of these cool science fiction multiverse things, the bottom line of the movie, the message at the end of it is find what gives you meaning and pursue that. And then life becomes meaningful for you because you've created or chosen meaning. So it's a subjective thing. And that might seem silly, especially to, I'm sure, a lot of you who are listening to this think in a pre-modern way like I do. That can seem awful silly. However, think about their alternative. Think about the alternative that they have. Yes, we would love to see them go back to more of a pre-modern way of thinking, but as they see it, their only options is modernism, where there is no meaning and purpose, and so we might as well just end it all. Or I can create my own meaning and purpose. So it's kind of, as I see it, an act of desperation, almost in a sense, like a cornered animal where they have nowhere else to turn. So they're just going to take this desperation. And this way of thinking, this postmodern way of thinking, has impacted the church as well, impacted Christianity. Because some Christian denominations, Christian thinkers, churches, have jumped on this bandwagon over the last 200 years and seen Christianity as one of these things that can give people meaning. It's not objectively true. They don't think Christianity is objectively true. It can be true for you if it gives you meaning and purpose and helps you live a good life. But it's not objectively true. It's just one of those subjective leap of faith type things. And this is how postmodernism is often understood, is it's just a leap of faith. If something gives you meaning and purpose, it doesn't have to have a rational explanation for why it gives you meaning and purpose. You just find that it does, then just take a leap of faith and believe it. It's your choice. So there's a big emphasis placed on choice. There's a big emphasis on your passions and desires. There's a very low emphasis on reason and rationality, so you don't have to explain why something gives you meaning and purpose. But if you find that it does, then go for it. Just take a leap of faith and believe in it. And that's how a lot of people even think about Christianity or any religious beliefs. Buddhism, they don't think it's objectively true, but hey, if it works for you, if it gives you meaning and purpose, then go for it. But this is the postmodern way of thinking, and this is what's illustrated then in the movie. So you get to the end of the movie, and the culmination, I guess the message of the movie comes from the dad. And I love this guy. He's a great actor. I was so excited for him to win his Oscar, because if you don't know, this is the Chinese actor who played in two of my favorite movies growing up. He played a kid. He's all grown up now, middle-aged, older than me. I would guess he's in his 50s. But he played in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. He was the young Chinese boy that was Indiana Jones' sidekick. And he was in Goonies. He was one of the main characters in Goonies. Played the Chinese boy who had all the inventions in the movie Goonies. So two of my favorite movies growing up in the 80s. But he's all grown up like I am now and is in this movie and won an Oscar. So very excited for him. And he seems like a great guy. But in the movie, he is the dad of the family, has, I guess the final message, or the main message of the movie, and that is to be kind. Be loving, in other words. Be loving and kind. But there's really no rationale behind it. Understand that. It's a great message. I think we should be kind, right? I think we were created to be kind. We were created for the purpose of loving God and loving others, being kind. So I agree with that. But within postmodernism, there's no reason that we should be kind. But if that gives you meaning and purpose, then that's what you should do. As you can see, this is part of the problem with the postmodern way of thinking, is that there's no objective constraints on what can give you meaning or doesn't give you meaning. So yes, if being kind gives you meaning, take that irrational leap of faith and just believe that is your purpose and do so. But it's not based on reason or logic. It's based more on feeling. There can't be an explanation or a defense that is our meaning and purpose. It just has to be an irrational leap of faith. The problem with these subjective meanings or subjective purposes to life is that there's no objective constraints. And so if being unkind gives you meaning, there's nothing there within postmodernism to say that being unkind shouldn't give you meaning and purpose. Let's say for whatever reason my wires are crossed, or I don't know, for whatever reason being unkind gives me a lot of meaning and purpose. Well, there's no constraints within the thinking, the system, which we call postmodernism, that would say, well, no, even though that gives you, for whatever reason, meaning and purpose, you shouldn't pursue that, because that would be an objectively bad thing to do. When you're stuck with only the subjective, then I don't see how you can escape the conclusion that anything goes. And this is actually illustrated in the movie, too. This was one of the things that really fascinated me, is towards the end, as this, before the "you should be kind" message really gets played out, the mom in the movie who's trying to rescue her daughter from this existential crisis. She's trying to rescue her daughter from wanting to destroy herself and take everything with her because there is no meaning and purpose. She goes on this mission, if you will. She's helping people enjoy, possibly discover and enjoy what they find meaning in. And so she goes through this process, and it's kind of comical because the audience laughs at all the silly things that people find meaning and purpose in, but it is kind of silly. So if protesting a certain cause gives you meaning and purpose, well, then go for it. If rescuing a certain species from extinction gives you meaning and purpose, then go for it. Just chase and search. I mean, some of those things are more serious. But like in the movie, one of the examples was, and I come to find out this is actually one of the writers and directors who put himself in the movie. But what gives this particular character in the movie, maybe in real life too, I don't know the guy, but at least his character in the movie, the way he put himself in it, wrote himself in it, and then acted in it, what gave his character meaning and purpose was being whipped in a sexual way. He enjoyed that, what must have been his fetish, right? But that is what gave him a lot of meaning and satisfaction and purpose in life, being whipped in a sexual sense. And so the movie kind of, we all chuckle about that in the audience as we're watching it. But that just goes to show that in this postmodern way of thinking, it's anything goes. Whatever happens to give you meaning and purpose, well, that's what you should chase after. Just to fight against and oppose the devastating conclusion of modernism that there is no meaning and purpose. Anything is better than that. And so even if what gives you meaning and purpose is being whipped in a sexual way, well, that's better than just a meaningless life. You could have this subjective meaning instead. So it's important that we understand what our culture is going through and how these big philosophical ideas are communicated through art, through movies, through music, so we can discuss it with our culture. As we're trying to reach our culture for Christ, we're trying to point out that, yes, life should be about being kind, but you know what? You don't have to take an irrational leap of faith to believe that. There's actually a good explanation as to why being kind is and should be the very purpose of our life. It's because that we were created by a God who loves us, a Trinitarian God who exists as a community of three persons in loving relationship with each other, and we were created to, in a sense, join that loving community. To be like God, not to be gods, but to be like God enough, made in His image, that we can join that fellowship of loving God and loving each other. So that's our purpose. It's an object of purpose. It's not an irrational leap of faith. There's good reasons and evidence to believe that is true. So as we're trying to communicate that message, it's important to know kind of where our Western thinking has come from and the conundrums that our culture has found itself in through these philosophical movements, so we can step in and try to help people and correct their thinking. And one of the great ways I love doing it is through movies like this. So if you haven't seen the movie, check it out. Start some good conversations with people about it and understand, why this movie, I think, has gotten, besides just it was written well and acted well, I think one of the reasons it was so successful is its hit on some of the major movements, the major thinking that our culture has gone through over the last few hundred years.